again, I'm back. There was a minor pet emergency thing. So I'm going to put this lecture up in two parts because it would take forever to edit them together. So you have part 1 and now part 2, which should be about 50 minutes, something like that. Okay, so remember the trends in the Second Temple period that many of the sectarians had to some extent or another that make the Second Temple period religiously and philosophically distinct. These are characteristics that mark the Second Temple period. Some parts of the Second Temple period more than others, particularly under the Romans, because the Romans exacerbated sectarian conflict and other forms of tension going on in the land to such an extent that we see a heightened fervor, a heightened passion for these things. Eschatology, the belief in the end of days, and apocalypticism, the belief that there would be an apocalypse, a belief that different private groups had secret knowledge about the end of days. And messianism, sort of the expectation of the rise of a leader that would end foreign influence, that would restore the covenant to its true glory, and that would exert God's will, like Cyrus, like David. Now, these trends were colored with the dualism that the Jews absorbed from the Persians, because remember, in ancient Judaism, there really is no sense of dualism. God makes both good and evil in ancient Israelite religion. But the Jews at this point were starting to develop dualism. Now, this does not become a super strong trend in Judaism after the Second Temple period. Judaism today still largely believes that God makes both good and evil, or good and bad, and that humans simply can't access the reasoning behind these things. But dualism becomes incredibly important in, say, Christianity as an offshoot of Judaism, where Satan becomes a much stronger figure. So dualism, eschatology, apocalypticism, messianism, all of these came out of or were heightened by the conflict and the civil unrest of the period, and were colored with a belief that God would have his reckoning, that people who did bad would be punished, and that people who did good would be restored to the covenant. Now, the interesting thing about the sectarian nature of the Second Temple period is that many Jews counted each other in this reckoning, that my group of Jews are the true Jews, and other Jews will be destroyed by God in the reckoning because they're not perfect. And this really is a trend of the Second Temple period. This striving to perfect the covenant, to perfect the community, to purify Judaism, because the dominance of the Romans, and to some extent the dominance of the Persians and the Greeks, were perceived as being God telling the Jews that they were not perfect in their keeping of the covenant, and that's why he was withholding power from them. So there is in this period a real desire to perfect the community, to perfect the covenant, to perfect themselves, so that the Romans would be gone. And this is particularly heightened during the Romans because the Romans interfered a lot, and there was an expectation that God was going to settle their hash soon. There's also theologically and ethically during this period a push towards perfecting the world. And this is also something that is largely absorbed from Zoroastrianism, the religion of the Persians, that this idea that through being good, through doing good, through choosing good, recognizing good versus evil, you can perfect the world, you can make the world the way God wanted it to be. And this blends with the ethical monotheism of Ezra's generation. Ethics is also a strong trend in the Second Temple period. This idea that it's not just important to do things ritually correctly, but it's also important to do things ethically correctly. Specifically, we see the development of the doctrine of tikkun olam in this period, the mending of the world through good works. And sometimes through revolution. So in this period, nationalism blends with religious fervor, a desire to restore the true covenant, to bring about the restoration of the Davidic power, and to end the control of the land by foreign powers is an incredibly strong dynamic amongst many of the sects. The Sadducees or the Zadokites often drew their power from the Greco-Roman force. They also drew their wealth from that power. But many Pharisees, and certainly the Zealots and other groups, wanted the end of foreign rule. So the Second Temple period is marked by civil unrest. It's one of the major defining characteristics of the Second Temple period, and the desire to regain the sovereignty of Israel as a sign that God was still with Israel. So under the Persians, they lived autonomously. They were not overly aware of the dominance of the Persians. But under the Greco-Romans, domination at times becomes more visible, and there were 4 attempts of revolution in this period. And we already looked at the revolution against the Seleucid Empire, the Maccabean revolt, and this led to the Hasmonean dynasty, of course. Against the Romans, because the Romans interfered more than the Greeks, generally speaking, there were 3 major wars. There was no formal declaration for some of these wars, so the boundaries are kind of hazy. The First Jewish War from 66 to 73, the so-called Great Revolt. This resulted in the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. The diasporic Jewish rebellions, or the Kitos Wars, this happened across the Roman Empire, where diasporic Jews rose up against the Romans in any way they could. And the Bar Kokhba Revolt, which was a failed Messianic nationalist movement to destroy the Roman Empire. This was fueled by an assumption that the destruction of the temple in 70 CE would not be permanent, and that God would forgive the Jews and would restore the temple. And all of these subsequent wars were really about the grief of the destruction of the temple, a desire for revenge for the destruction of the temple, and a belief that God would restore the temple and restore Israel. All of the problems with the Romans really also roots from the deification of the Emperor Caligula in 39 CE, which spurred the imperial cult in the empire. This demand on behalf of the Romans, on the part of the Romans, that if you are a Roman citizen, you also worship the emperor. And this, of course, was inconsistent with Jewish monotheism as it was reconstructed after the Babylonian exile. The Jews believed if they worshipped the emperor, then they would lose the land. They would the covenant would be broken. So this was a major sticking point. Our main sources for these revolutions, we see snippets of it in Christian texts. We see snippets of it at Qumran, at least the expectation of war. We see snippets of it. We get a lot of Roman material, and we get Josephus. Josephus was a first century Jewish historian who wrote in Latin. So he was associated with the Romans, educated as a Roman, but he was Jewish. So his texts are generally seen as some of the most important historical records of this period. And he writes closer to what we would recognize as history, an attempt to record history. But all of these sources have their own agendas, their own slants. So really we have to also look at archaeology to sort of make sense of these different records. Okay, so the Jewish War, the Great Revolt. Now, Josephus is our main source for a lot of the Great Revolt, and I believe I've asked you to read a section of Josephus about the Great Revolt. So the First Jewish War, the Great Revolt, began basically over taxation. The Romans wanted money. out of Jerusalem. They were heavily engaged in empire building, and empire building takes money. You need an army, you need wealth. And in 76 CE, the Romans took great quantity of money and treasure out of the temple. So this was sacred gold being taken by a secular foreign a foreign government for secular use, and this was the final straw. The Romans had engaged in inappropriate behaviors before. Pompey actually walked into the Holy of Holies to prove that God wouldn't strike him down. So the Romans were on thin ice to begin with. But in 76 CE, they declared that Judea was owed back taxes, and they went into the temple to take gold out of the temple. And this sparked the Great Revolt. When Jews witnessed what was happening, they decided to rise up. They thought this was the time. There was an expectation of a war coming anyway, so they were waiting for a signal. And they were expecting that they were on the right side and that God would save them, that God would be on their side and they would win. Now, there were many supporters of the war. It's hard to tell what common people wanted, but the common people, as far as we can tell, were not terribly impressed with the Romans either, particularly with them taking money from the temple. This would have been seen as offensive to most Jews, if not all. Perhaps not the Essenes, because the Essenes believed that the temple was illegitimate to begin with. But the Zealots, as a sect, it was sort of a warrior purity group that were preparing for war for generations. They were the main vehicle of the Great Revolt, and a lot of people put faith in the Zealots and their training that they would be the tool of God's salvation. They saw themselves as the new Maccabees. Remember, the Maccabees revolted against the Greeks and won against all odds. So there was precedence in Jewish imagination, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. They weren't pretending, but in their imagination, in their concepts, in their history, there was precedence for overcoming great odds to win, particularly in the defense of their religion. Yet there were also concerns. The sages, for one, were skeptical that the Zealots could win. They doubted that victory. The Pharisees particularly doubted that they could win such a war, that the Roman Empire was so vast and so strong and so efficient. They doubted that there would be victory, and they worried about continuity. They wanted to just sort of ride it out and survive it. So not all sects at the time were super into the Great Revolt, but everyone was swept up into the Great Revolt, whether they supported it or not. So in 66, the uprising led to 60,000 heavily armed Roman soldiers pouring into Roman Palestine. They conquered the countryside and effectively participated in ethnic cleansing. There were massacres in the countryside. And then they cornered Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was besieged for 2 years. So besieged means no one could get in or out. No supplies could get in or out. Disease and starvation ran rampant in the cities. They did have water, but the water quickly became fouled with waste and with when a city in this period is besieged, you can't even get your dead bodies out. So people are dying of starvation. They're also dying of natural causes, but you can't get them out of the city because people buried their dead outside of the city to protect themselves from disease and from having their water contaminated. No one could get out during this period. The Romans did allow some burial of corpses outside the city at times, but this was variable. So disease and starvation ran rampant. And if we do look to Josephus, he describes the famine during the siege of Jerusalem. The famine increased, and the misery of the weaker was aggravated by seeing the stronger obtaining food. All natural affection was extinguished. Husbands and wives, parents and children snatching the last morsel from each other. So this is a desperate situation. Many wretched men were caught by the Romans prowling in the ravines by night to pick up food, and these were scourged, tortured, and crucified. This was done to terrify the rest, and it went on till there was not wood enough for crosses. So the crucifixion was a Roman form of execution that was particularly identified with the Romans. And crucifixion was seen as so barbarous by the Jews that crucifixion itself became one of the reasons the Jews sought revolt. It was a terrible way to die. Terrible crimes were committed in the city. The aged high priest Matthias was accused of holding a communication with the enemy. 3 of his sons were killed in his presence, and he was executed in sight of the Romans, together with 16 other members of the Sanhedrin. The famine grew so woeful that a woman devoured the body of her own child. The siege was as terrible as the fall. So death, disease, stress, obviously panic for 2 years. And I don't think it's easy for us to access what it would be like to be besieged for 2 years in an ancient city. And there's some evidence that infighting in the city was making it worse, that people were actively preventing others from accessing food. There's evidence that the zealots themselves destroyed food sources to keep their competitors from getting it and distributing it to the people. So the sects inside the city were also fighting each other. So there was a civil war effectively breaking out inside the city as the Romans were laying siege to it on the outside. This was a horrible, horrible time. And it results in the fall of the temple in 70 CE. So accounts of the fall, such as Josephus the Khurban, the Great Destruction, the tragedy, this cataclysm meaning that nothing was the same afterwards. The cataclysm is actually still marked today in Judaism. The Tisha B'Av fast commemorates the fall of the temple. So that's how devastating and how important this was in Jewish memory. Josephus effectively tells us, so the siege occurred for 2 years, and then finally the Romans breached the walls of the city, and they basically go through the city, killing people as they go to reach the temple. The defenders of the sanctuary clashed with those who were fighting the fire in the inner temple, but the Romans put the Jews to fight and went as far as the sanctuary itself. Meanwhile, one of the soldiers, without waiting for orders and heedless of such dreadful deed, but urged on by a divine fury, snatched something from the blaze, and hoisted up by a colleague, set fire to a golden window given to the chambers near the sanctuary on the north side. As the flames went upwards, the Jews cried out at the disaster and ran together to prevent it, risking their lives and stopping at nothing to prevent the ruin of the temple for whose sake they had fought so long. Neither pleas nor threats could restrain the violence of the unrushing legions, but all were governed by rage. As they crowded into the temple, many were trampled by each other, and others stumbled blindly amongst the ruins of the hot, smoking porticos and shared in the fate of their vanquished foes. So some of the Romans themselves even ended up getting trampled and dying in the fire. Reaching the temple, they seemed not to hear Caesar's orders to the contrary, but urged those in front to add to the fire. The rebels were unable to do anything, and death and carnage were everywhere. Most citizens were weak and unarmed, and had their throats cut wherever they were caught. And round about the altar lay heaps of corpses, and the steps of the sanctuary ran with their blood as the bodies killed up above slid down on top of them. The flame immediately burst out from within the sanctuary itself, and then the officers, including Caesar, retreated, and there was nobody to forbid those outside adding to the blaze, so the sanctuary was burnt down. without Caesar's approval, Josephus adds. Remember, his patronage depends on the Romans, so he's trying to make the Romans sound good a little bit. While the sanctuary was burning, all that came to hand was looted, and thousands of captives were killed. And this is what the triumphal arch of Titus depicts, the looting of the temple. So everything, all of the ancient treasures were carried out of the temple as it was burning. So it was made out of stone, but there were also clearly like wooden and plaster elements that did burn to destroy it. No pity was shown for youth or respect for age, but children and old men and laity and priests were all alike killed, so that this war engulfed and destroyed all sorts of people, whether begged or fought for their lives. The flame carried a long way and echoed with the groans of the fallen, and as the hill was high and the temple buildings were large, it seemed the whole city was on fire. Nothing louder or more terrible than this noise is imaginable. Mingling the shouting of the Roman legions and the cries of the rebels, now surrounded by sword and fire. Those who were left above were forced back onto the enemy and wailed in panic at their lot. And the people in the city joined their cries with those up on the hill. And many who were wasted and silenced by hunger broke out again into groans and shouts on seeing the sanctuary on fire, until Perea and the mountains round about returned the echo, increasing its volume. Even more terrible was the disaster itself, for the hill on which the temple stood seemed boiling hot, as though shot through with fire, and the bloodshed spread wider than the fire, and there seemed more of the slain than of the killers. The ground could not be seen for all the corpses laying on it, and the soldiers marched over heaps of bodies in pursuit of the fugitives. 1 million estimated murdered in the fall of Jerusalem, particularly on the Temple Mount, as Jews rushed to the Temple Mount with whatever they had. Hungry, starved, diseased people, barely able to survive, rushed to the Temple Mount to protect it. This is how important the temple was to the Jews. And yet it fell. It was burnt and looted, and the people killed. The theological and practical implications of this fall are, as you can imagine, quite numerous for the Jews. So Josephus himself seems to reflect a rather traditional view that if the temple was destroyed, it must have been God's will. The temple would not have been destroyed had it not been God's will. So a lot of people felt that if we lost the temple, it must be our fault. And this cycle of punishment and return, that yes, we were punished and we lost the temple, but eventually we would return, it was often associated with the sin of Hellenization. We Hellenized too much. We took on too much Greek and Roman culture, too much Greek and Roman money. We allowed the Greeks and Romans to invade us and infiltrate our religion. So if we purify ourselves of Hellenization, then the temple will be returned to us. Other Jews simply did lose faith in God, that perhaps the Romans are just stronger than God. And this is sort of a modern doubting that we see for the first time in Judaism. Others, particularly the Christians, did also interpret this as the break of the covenant. The Christians interpreted the fall of the temple as God breaking with the Jews and siding with the Christians and moving on to the Christians. The sages, the Pharisees, the later rabbis actually had a different interpretation. And their interpretation was that God wanted a fresh start. And we'll get to that as we move on. But really, it comes down to what Judaism will look like after the temple. The rabbis had an answer for that, or developed an answer to that. And they developed the belief that God let the temple fall because it was time for Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, to come to flower, and for the Jews to move on from sacrifice. Nevertheless, the Western Wall, the last remaining visible part of the temple, is still a symbolic and religious center of Judaism. The Temple Mount, Zion, is still a really important pilgrimage site for Jews. So this wasn't the end of the revolt. It kind of was, in a way. People sort of lost heart. There was a loss of their center. It was a loss of spirit. But the Zealots continued to fight, and they pulled into, in the end, in 73 CE, there was about 960 Zealots with their families that had withdrawn to Masada. This is a fortress near the Dead Sea. And the Romans again laid siege to it. It's an incredibly hard fortress to penetrate because it is on such a steep sort of crag. And the Romans were building ramps, and they were building siege contraptions to finally take Masada. And we get the story of the ritual suicide of the Zealots that take place at Masada. According to legend, the Zealots, realizing the Romans were going to breach Masada, killed their wives and children, and then committed suicide in an act that is largely described as Kaddish Hashem, the sanctification of the name. This is not suicide in terms of self-annihilation. This is suicide to honor the name of God, to prevent capture, to prevent loss. We see this in the Middle Ages. This becomes actually a pretty important paradigm in the town of Mainz and in what is now Germany. In 1096, when the Christians butchered the Jews, many Jews committed suicide in an act of Kaddish Hashem, killing themselves, their wives, and their children so that their children would not be taken and raised as Christians or just simply slaughtered. And it was considered an act of honorable suicide. Honorable suicide is not a heavy tradition within Judaism because the priority is always on life, not on death. But here, Masada leaves a really important paradigm in the memory of the Jews, of the last stand of the rebels against Rome, who, according to legend, took their lives. We don't have much evidence to back this up, and some people actually suggest that it didn't occur, but it doesn't matter. The memory of the suicide at Masada becomes really important within Jewish imagination for a really long time. So that's the end of the Great Revolt. And here we see a coin from the Romans. This is the Emperor Vespasian, who was Josephus's patron, who Josephus portrays as telling people, no, stop, don't burn the temple. Whether he actually did or not, I think it's suspect, because Josephus had reasons to suggest that that Vespasian was the good guy in all this, but whatever. This is a Roman coin celebrating Judea Capta, and this is the inscription here, Judea Capta, and this is Judea, a veiled woman in chains with a Roman legion standing over her. This was a coin that was utilized throughout the Roman Empire to celebrate the destruction of Jerusalem. Jews lived throughout the Roman Empire, so Jews actually had to use this coin throughout the empire. You can imagine how the bitterness, the desire for revenge would actually almost be stoked every time they laid hands on one of these coins. And this bitterness, this grief, this desire for revenge, the belief, the disbelief that the temple had been destroyed permanently, and the belief that God would restore them once they proved their devotion, led to the later rebellions. The Second Jewish War, the Kitos War, of diasporic Jews throughout the empire. Sometimes called the Third Jewish War, or the Bar Kokhba Revolt, the Bar Kokhba Revolt, means son of the star, because Bar Kokhba was understood to be a Messiah. People read Numbers 24:17, there will rise a star of David, or a star of Jacob, and people associated Bar Kokhba with the star of Jacob, the royal Messiah, the king Messiah, who would come and defeat the Romans and restore Israel to its Davidic glory. This was an unlikely to succeed revolt, but it was an incredibly fervent revolt because nationalism blended with messianism and the Jewish expectation that God was on their side. So there was a belief that even though this doesn't look like, it doesn't look very feasible, but God's on our side, so we can do it. In fact, the Rabbi Akiva, who's often considered to be one of the greatest sages of this age, was murdered because he supported Bar Kokhba. So there was a pretty wide-ranging, pretty diverse group of people who did believe that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah, and this was the time. It did not win. He did not win. In fact, when the Third Jewish War came to an end, the Emperor Hadrian, the Roman Emperor Hadrian, actually instituted a pretty massive, harsh anti-Judaic program in the Roman Empire to try to prevent any further rebellions. Hadrian was actually a pretty interesting emperor. He embraced Greek philosophy. He actually embraced Persian philosophy. At a time, Hadrian talked about being the new Cyrus and rebuilding the temple to sort of gain the love of the Jews like Cyrus had. The Bar Kokhba revolt put an end to that. There was no more talk of rebuilding the temple. And in fact, Jerusalem, what was left of Jerusalem that had been standing after the destruction of 70 CE, was razed to the ground. In a punitive measure to sort of retaliate and to so totally crush the Jewish spirit that there would not be another revolt. And he razed Jerusalem to the ground, and he built Aelia Capitolina instead. So a very typical Roman capital city on what used to be Jerusalem. And on the Temple Mount, to really knock home, he built a temple of Jupiter, we believe, also probably a temple to the imperial cult. So this was a symbolic act of like, we are now in charge here and you need to stop. You are not getting this city back. We have destroyed it utterly and we've put our own city here. So stop fighting. Subjugate or get out. And in fact, many Jews were slaughtered and enslaved during the crushing of these revolts as a desire, out of a desire to totally crush the spirit of the Jews and prevent any further uprisings. And this is what we refer to sort of as the Great Diaspora. Many Jews were deported out of Roman Palestine. Some Jews remained, but only if they were like peasants and sort of kept their nose out of things. But Jews were even barred from making pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Between 70 CE and 135 CE, we're fairly certain there would have been Jews still attempting to make sacrifice on what was left of the Temple Mount. With the construction of the Temple of Jupiter on the Temple Mount, this would have stopped, and Jews were no longer even allowed to make pilgrimage from the diaspora to Jerusalem, because there was a fear that people coming into Jerusalem, particularly for holidays when there'd be large crowds of Jews in Jerusalem, that it was a powder keg and any spark would start another revolt. So this is the Great Diaspora. So we have the diaspora that occurs after the Babylonian exile, but many of those Jews chose to return. In 135, we get the Great Diaspora, and the Jews become a global people, still today, a diasporic people. Now, Jews had remained in Babylon after the Babylonian exile, and so for 600 years, although we don't have a lot of records of what they were doing, they were living their Jewish lives, and they were living as Jews in conversation with the Jews in Israel and traveling back and forth. Like, we think of the ancient world as being a pretty low-tech, low-travel-tech kind of place, but they were connected through language, and they were connected through texts, and they not text messages, but texts, sacred texts. They were connected through pilgrimage. They were connected through trade. So these communities were still very much in contact. But the Babylonian communities were flourishing 600 years later. So when Jerusalem was destroyed, the Babylonian communities became absolutely essential to the survival of Judaism and to the survival of the survivors from Jerusalem. They gave homes to the refugees. They took in the refugees. Many Jews fled from Roman Palestine to Babylon, and they were taken in. They were given money and support and jobs and homes. And the Babylonian community had the sacred texts. They had copies of the sacred texts. As you can imagine, many copies of books were destroyed in the defeat of the Jews in 70 and 73 CE. So the Babylonians had copies of those things, and that is a miracle that so many of the texts survived. And they also had a built-in leadership. Now, in this period, we already had synagogues. So there were synagogues throughout the Jewish world at this period. But there were also academies, schools of learning in Babylon that became central, quite essential to the survival of Judaism. And they provided leadership. The exilarch, so that's a hereditary office of the official leader or spokesman of the Jews of Babylonia. And the Patriarchate, which is the official leader or spokesman of the Jews in the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, which also became hereditary. So we had figures within the diaspora that could provide leadership. Ethnarch, which is the leader of a people, and the Nazi, so princes of the community, so noblemen really. And these people effectively offered leadership in light of the loss of the temple and the Sanhedrin, which were significant losses. So Judaism records that God will always leave a remnant. Whenever there is a destruction, a Churban, God has promised to always leave a remnant of the Jews. People after 70 CE viewed themselves as the remnant, that God's mercy had allowed them to survive. For whatever reason, he destroyed the temple. He also remembered the covenant and left a remnant to survive. So for many people, this was a sign that the covenant was still active. But how do you do Judaism without the temple? Jews had had some practice with this, but not a lot, and it was a long time ago. And the temple had really become the heart of Judaism under Ezra until its destruction. No temple means no sacrifice, and no sacrifice could possibly mean no covenant, no way to fulfill the covenant and regain the land. So the loss of the temple is pretty significant. But also no temple means no holiness, no purity, no kavod, no glory of God living amongst the people. So how do you reconfigure Judaism without the temple at its heart? The Pharisees were already kind of working on this. Acts of loving kindness, acts of ethics and morality, acts of devotion other than sacrifice. These things were already in place. Synagogues were already in place. So much of the ingredients of Judaism without the temple already existed, but somebody had to pull it together for the remnant that were scattered and terrified and in immense grief. And this fell to the sages that managed to survive the siege. And there's a great story. Ben Zakkai, who was one of the sages in Jerusalem at the time of the fall of the temple, or at the time of the siege of Jerusalem, he knew the siege was not going to go well. He knew the Romans were going to win. And he was like, we need to save Jewish tradition. Whatever happens here, Judaism has to survive. So Ben Zakkai and his students came up with a plan. Now, Ben Zakkai laid apparently very ill. Disease was rampant, so this was not hard to pass off. He laid very ill in his bed. People came to visit him. And he actually put dead fish under his mattress, so there would be an increasingly bad smell about him. So people would assume that it was some sort of gangrene going on. And people came to visit him to witness his illness. So word spread. The great Ben Zakkai, the great leader of one of the great leaders of the Sanhedrin, is dying. And the Romans, even the Roman spies, because Romans had spies going on in the area, so they knew the news too. Ben Zakkai, one of the great leaders, was dying. And eventually he died. And his students put him in a wooden coffin, still with his dead fish in there, so he would be smelly, and carried him to the walls. And they fell on the mercy of the Roman centurions, saying, our great leader has died. We need to give him the respect of burial. You leave corpses in the streets of the regular people, but this one we need to bury appropriately. And the centurions said, okay. And they carried the coffin out. And when they got out, Ben Zakkai, who had not died, jumps out of the coffin and they all run, which is an absolutely lovely, incredible story. He wasn't just running to save himself, though. Ben Zakkai had effectively had the Bible memorized, he had the Torah memorized, he had the oral law memorized, and he was seen as the living embodiment of the Sanhedrin. So he fled to Yavna, where there was a rabbinic academy, and there he began the work of writing down, collecting all the texts that could be salvaged, and writing down all of the stuff that he could remember, and teaching everyone that he could what he remembered. And Ben Zakkai effectively becomes the savior of Judaism, because it's Ben Zakkai, his little plan to get out of Jerusalem, knowing that it was going to fall, allowed so much Jewish knowledge to survive the fall of the temple and the loss of what must have been massive quantities of documents and memories. It is at this point that Judaism really clues in to we can't rely on the memories of a few people. We actually have to rely on the memory of everybody. So it's at this point that Jewish education starts to become even more important. Ezra knew the importance of Hebrew, and he knew the importance of reading Torah, but there was still specialties, right? Sages and priests, they were the ones who knew the law. Ben Zakkai and his generation recognized, well, what happens if the priests and the sages all die? We're going to lose knowledge. So it's at this point that Jewish education becomes a cornerstone of Judaism. Every child, until at least the age of 13, needs to learn the documents, needs to learn the laws, because there will always be a remnant, but we don't know who that remnant's going to be. It could be you, or it could be me. So what do we remember? What can we put together if another cataclysm occurs? What documents can we save? This becomes a major cornerstone of Judaism. You spread the knowledge out, you spread the education out, so the community is stronger and more able to survive because more people know the law. It's dangerous to keep it in the hands of a few elite people. So the Judaism that he took out with him from the sage was a combination of Ezra's reform, text, especially Talmud. He knew the synagogue system and valued the synagogue system. He knew the knowledge of the sages. He embraced the doctrine of loving kindness, of ethical monotheism. And the sacrifice of the tongue, that is the way that reading Torah and praying and singing can substitute for animal sacrifice. And he also took with him the memory of the temple and the calendar, which the Babylonian Jews already also had. And they all had with them the common Judaism of the period, not necessarily the sectarian Judaism. There were members of all different sects who survived, presumably. But the common Judaism of the period focused on temple, Torah, Sabbath, the kosher laws, the importance of family and community, and the value of synagogues. Temple was lost, but the tools of compensating for the loss of the temple were there. Memory, calendar, acts of loving kindness, ethical monotheism, and Torah. Torah essentially becomes temple. So in our basic 3 pillars of Judaism, God, covenant, and Israel, God remains monotheistic. Temple, or the covenant, switches in many ways from temple to Torah, the law of the covenant. And Israel becomes less focused on the land itself and more focused on the continual survival of the people, or on the community. So Israel can mean people, but it also can mean the community. So it has that double meaning. And after the loss of the temple and after the diaspora, the great diaspora, Israel in the 3 pillars becomes more focused on community rather than land. So this is effectively what early rabbinic Judaism is, the rebuilding of a Judaism without the temple, focused on rabbinic learning and rabbinic texts. They were using the context and the ingredients that they got from Judaism before the fall, where Pharisaic Judaism, the sect that was cynical about the war, ends up sort of on top. The Pharisees don't just become the rabbis, but Pharisaic Judaism, that is the idea that you can reason the law and apply it reasonably, comes to the forefront. And a belief in oral Torah, which the Pharisees brought with them. And a lot of innovations, the idea of prayer as sacrifice, and how to turn the synagogue into effectively temples, places of the sacrifice of the tongue. So who were the rabbis? They were the sages, people who carried the oral law, possibly remnants of the Sanhedrin, but also learned members of other sects that probably integrated and became more than Pharisaic Judaism. And they were the ones focusing, or sort of stemming out of the great academies of the period. So in Jerusalem, or in Israel, we lost Jerusalem, but we still had Yavna, we had Bet Sherim, we had Tiberias, and Caesarea, and these remain rabbinic academies in this reconstructive period. In Babylonia, we had Sura, Nahardiyah, and Pumbeditha. And these were great schools for rabbinic learning, and they wrote many, many letters and documents back and forth on religious topics. Rabbinic Judaism is that Judaism which embraces Mishnah, or oral law, as well as Torah, rabbinic learning, and later the Talmud. The rabbinic Bible was canonized during this phase with the 24 books, which none could be added to. Remember, the Tanakh, the Bible, was pretty fluid up until this point, but the rabbis firmed that up. And they recorded the Mishnah. Judah Hanasi is another one of those founding figures. So if you're keeping count, we have Abraham, Moses, some people would include David, Ezra, and the rabbis Hillel, Akiva, Ben Zakkai. I think he deserves a place on there, and Judah Hanasi. So far, these are sort of our founding figures of Judaism as we know it. And Judah Hanasi took the oral law, which becomes the life's blood of rabbinic Judaism, and he writes it down. So oral law becomes recorded law. Also considered Torah. So we have Torah, the 5 books of Moses. We also have Mishnah, the oral law, also Torah. And also Torah is Talmud, that comes out of the Babylonian academies and the Palestinian academies. So we have the Bavli, or Babylonian Talmud, and the Yerushalmi, the Palestinian Talmud. And we've looked at this before. This includes legal material, but it also includes non-legal material. And it's basically a record of the intense study that the early rabbis did to memorize the texts, to record the texts, both Torah and oral Torah, to expand on it, to do exegesis, which is to compare texts, one text to another, to teach it and to apply it. So the Talmud is a record of the many different polysemic opinions on the law, a record of what was being taught in these academies. And the Babylonian Talmud, the Bavli, contains mostly legal material. The Palestinian Talmud mostly contains midrash folklore, but the Babylonian Talmud really hits on law. So it becomes the legal code of the new Bet Dins. Bet Dins, rabbinical courts that essentially replace the Sanhedrin and spread throughout the land. So even today, you can go to a rabbi and have cases heard, and he makes a determination based on halakha, or the application of law. So this is what we mean by Talmudic Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism is essentially Talmudic Judaism. So it's those forms of Judaism rising from Rabbinic Judaism and founded on the Talmud. The belief that the covenant means purity of self and purity of community rather than simply sacrifice, that observance of the law is a matter of habit, dedication, personal dedication and habit, and also education, and that God's plan will unfold while the Jews just focus on the covenant and the law. So one of the great things, the smart things that the rabbis did, was to de-emphasize revolution, to emphasize the will of God. They maintained a belief in the Messiah, but it was no longer humans' duty to make that happen. God would make that happen in his time. So the rabbis sort of promoted a passive eschatology. We believe that the Messiah will come, but we need to focus on our books and no longer participate in revolution, because revolution just has us killed, and we survived these ones, but we may not survive the next one. So the preservation of Jewish life and sort of the skepticism around revolution becomes part and parcel of Rabbinic Judaism, and it becomes one of the ways in which Judaism survives, because the Romans would not have tolerated much more. There would have been more mass genocide occurring had they revolted again. So the three great achievements of Rabbinic Judaism, early Rabbinic Judaism: preserving the sages and the documents, preserving Judaism. Secondly, recording the Mishnah and the Talmud. Those are great landmark literatures that come out of early Rabbinic Judaism. And establishing, cultivating the great academies that would go on to not only reconstruct Judaism after the temple, but to maintain it. And Rabbinic Judaism obviously depends on synagogues and other community infrastructure rather than the temple. So it becomes decentralized, but it also becomes reproducible. So there is enough familiarity between Jewish communities, even though they no longer have the center, because texts become the center of continuity. As long as you hold the Torah, you're holding temple, and temple is portable now. Okay, so I'm running out of time, but generally speaking, the Rabbinic Jews kept monotheism, the unified eminent God, but future is less of a focus than history. Torah is both written and oral and lived, and it's for all Jews, not simply for an elite few. It has to be lived every day by everyone. Halakha is a concern for everyone. The liturgical calendar has to be as important in homes as it is in temple, to ensure the future, the survival. Israel is enduring. So even in the exile, the community exists and will exist. And in terms of creation, Tikkun Olam, the mending of the world, is our main activity. We have to mend creation in the will of God. We have to preserve life, cultivate life. Chai becomes the main principle of Judaism. Chai meaning life, not just human life, but animal life and plant life. To maximize life around you becomes incredibly important. To maintain a just society and the ethic of reciprocity, that is, charity and depending on one another as keys for survival. So learning, education, particularly the education of children, family and the production of children and the domestication of Judaism, the preservation of the community, the maintenance of ethics and morals rather than just rituals, although rituals are still important. The devotion and the dedication of the individual as well as the community, compassion, kindness, loving kindness, charity, being as God wants us to be, and the preservation of life and survival. These are sort of the basic tenets of Talmudic Judaism. Okay, so your discussion prompt for week 3. So this is the last day of this is the last class of week 3. On Thursday, we begin week 4. And I know that's confusing because it overlaps weeks, but it's just because our first day of class was Thursday. So your last, your post for week 3 is to define First Temple and Second Temple. You can include dates on there just because dates make it easier to remember things in order. But note the social differences, note the differences in the temple if you want, note whatever important differences comes to you from your readings and from lectures. And remember to post by Wednesday night for this week. Your next post will be a review of the unit. So because we are coming up against the next test, the first test, on October 5th at 12:30, and I'm going to talk to my learning space about how to make sure people start on time, because I noticed last year people would wait until the last 5 minutes of the test being open and then start. Don't do that. 12:30, the same as if we were in class. The test will not be open for the entire time because people abused that last year. So I'm going to have to figure out a way to make sure people start at 12:30 on time. There will be 75 multiple choice questions. You have 80 minutes to do it. It is not open book. So please, no devices, no notes. Just do it from memory. It's multiple choice. I'm expecting you to... Basically, I'm working on the honor system here because I'm not using webcams. Webcams are invasive and I'm not using them. And I realize this means some people will cheat, but I'm asking you not to. Okay? So we will review on Thursday. So catch up on the videos and the readings before Thursday if you can. That way the review lecture will be more useful to you. And I also have office hours on Thursdays that will be... pretty much dedicated to exam review if you want to come 4 o'clock on Thursday and ask any questions that you may have before the test. And remember, your first unit paper will also be due on October 8th. Now, this would have been essay questions for the test, but I instead just made it a paper. And your paper for Unit 1 is on the temple, the meaning of the temple, the importance of the temple, and so forth. So, couple of pages, double spaced on the temple. The instructions are on my learning space, and this will be worth 5%. Essay form, works cited, citations, all that stuff. Using course materials. Okay? So, oh, and there's the instructions, but the instructions are also on my learning space. We'll also touch on that on Thursday if we have time. Okay, so if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please email me. Use the discussion forum if you want to discuss readings and lectures. Study together if you want. Work alone on the test because otherwise it's cheating, but you can get together virtually and study for the test. I encourage you to do that. Compare notes. If you have any questions, if there are holes in your notes, things that you don't understand, please do email me. And again, I apologize for the 2 separate videos and probable lateness because it takes forever to upload these things. But I'm doing my best here, okay? We're getting through the term. If you have any questions, please let me know. Bye for now, and I will see you again on Thursday.